Chapter 376, Heading to the Conference. When status Name Rendover. Rank, B. Strength, B. Agility, B+. Stamina, B. Intelligence, B. Mana capacity, B. Luck, A+. Charm, C+. Profession. Swordsmanship, LVL.4. The degree of understanding of the sword has evolved to the next level. User will find it easier to understand previously harder concepts. Martial Manual. Keiki Style. Essence Realm of Mastery. Sword art created by Grandmaster Toshimoto Keiki. A 5-star module focused primarily on reaching the apex of swordsmanship and speed. Upon mastery, the sword art becomes so fast that before an opponent could even think about their next move, their heads would already be rolling on the ground. Ring of Vindication. Essence Realm of Mastery. Highly advanced sword art that creates a perfect ring of defense around the user. The ring can create a 3-dimensional sphere that protects the user from all sides upon mastery. Because of the lack of offensive capabilities, the manual was graded 3 stars. Drifting Steps. Greater Realm of Mastery. Movement art that progresses with each step. With every step taken, user speed will increase. Unless the user stops, speed will continuously improve until the user either runs out of mana or is injured. Quick Slash Style. Minor Realm of Mastery. A sword art fully focused on speed. With one quick draw, the user gains the ability to kill an opponent without them noticing anything had happened. Created to replicate the Keiki style. After years of research, this sword art was the result. Full Body Martial Arts. Greater Realm of Mastery. Hand-to-hand combat technique dedicated to utilizing every single part of the body to incapacitate the enemy. It may be a 3-star art, but upon mastery, it can be used to complement other forms of martial art. Skills. Monarch's Indifference. A skill that enables users to erase all emotions, and act as a supreme monarch that only calculates the best option regardless of circumstance. The One. A skill that enables the user to instill fear into the opponent's minds, resulting in them feeling like they were standing before a sovereign that overlooked everything. The skill may work on individuals who are 1 rank higher than them. However, if the difference between the 2 parties is greater than 2 ranks, the skill effect diminishes. Eyes of Kronos. Upon using this skill, the user will be able to see everything in slow motion. The more mana is used, the slower the time will be in their eyes. I'm slowly getting there. I inwardly muttered as I stared at my charm, which was now in the rank range. After my contract with Angelica dissolved, my charm and my stats immediately dropped back down to where they were originally supposed to be. For about a week, staring at myself in the mirror, depression once again overcame me as recollections of my handsome days would spring upon me from time to time. Still wasn't over it if I had to be honest. That aside, my strength did drastically rise over the past year, and just a few months ago I broke through to rank. Can't have everything, I muttered in consolation. Swoosh. Closing down my status window, a clear mountain breeze blew past and shook the leaves of the tree that I was sitting on. The rays of light coming from the sun filtered through the gaps of the leaves, creating a small net that sank over me. A calm peace enshrouded the area that I was in, inviting anyone present to want to relax. Of course, that was merely what was perceived on the outside. Rustle. Rustle. It wasn't long before the peace was broken as a clear rustling sound resounded from the nearby bushes. Roar. With a powerful roar, coming out of the bushes was a large brown bear with red eyes and sharp claws that were about the same size as my arms. A threatening aura expanded from its body, scaring away all of the nearby birds as they flew into the sky. An evolved black bear. It's also ranked at that. Not bad. Staring at the bear with great interest from the tree that I was sitting on, my eyes squinted slightly. That was because a little fox was standing opposite the bear, growling at it with its canines. Looks like the bear was in the middle of his hunt. It had to be noted that this was no regular bear but an evolved one. Their diet was drastically different from what they were prior to when they were normal bears. Roar. With another roar, the bear raised his body halfway up in the air and shot towards the fox that was standing opposite to it. It wasn't long before the bear and the fox neared the area that I was in. Well, guess that's my cue. Hew up. Tugging my body forward and leaving the branch that I was sitting on, My body slowly fell to the ground at a high velocity before perfectly landing on the top of the bear's head. Bang! Despite our size difference, the moment my foot pressed onto the skull of the bear, with a loud bang, the beast's head crashed against the ground. Dust diffused in the air, masking my eyesight. Swoosh! But of course this was no problem for me. Waving my hand slightly and channeling my wind scions, a small wind formed, blowing all of the dust away. Well, that's dinner sorted. Cleaning my hands, I got off the bear and took a good look at it. With all 4 legs outstretched from its body, the bear laid on the ground unmoving. I didn't need to check whether it was dead as its skull was practically crushed into a pulp. Jar. Just as I was about to skin the bear, I heard a slight growling sound coming from behind me. Turning around, I noticed the small fox from before glaring in my direction. Before I could even make out what was going on, the fox darted in my direction. Its claws were outstretched trying to claw into me. I just saved you, and instead of being grateful you're attacking me? Click. Without even moving, turning my attention back to the bear, a subtle clicking sound rang out and I heard a small thump from behind me. Ugh, how did Waylon say that I should skin a bear? Staring at the bear in front of me, I started to ponder over the different methods that Waylon had taught me about skinning a beast, but in the end, shrugging my shoulders, I just decided to put the bear's body into my dimensional space. Oh right, there's you too. Once I put the bear back into my dimensional space, turning around, I found the dead body of the fox from before. Guess we're having roast and stew tonight. Picking it up, I also put it in my dimensional space. Humming a tune, I headed back deep into the forest, towards my camp and where the others were. The location of the camp wasn't far. About a 10-minute walk from where I previously was. Coming out from one of the bushes, the first thing I saw were multiple tents set up on a flat piece of land. In the middle of the tents, a fire crackled, and sitting around it was everyone apart from Douglas, who for obvious reasons couldn't come. They were all having a merry good time talking to each other and drinking whatever drink they had in their hands. I'm back. I smiled as I approached. Back already? Waylon was the first to react as he looked at me from his seat. After him, the others also looked in my direction, but in contrast to the warm welcome that I had expected, they had all looks that asked the question, "Where's the food?" Not one of them seemed to think about anything else. I spoiled them too much, I thought as a bitter smile appeared on my face, but I kept walking regardless. I was the one who dragged them out to the forest as soon as the demons retreated. This was so that everyone could get some good training, which they did and learned a lot from, but still they did hold a bit of resentment towards me. After all, with how advanced the dwarves were, training there was not a problem. The one that held the most resentment was probably Small Snake, who would snort from time to time whenever he would see my face. "Why do I need to train when you know that I have no talent?" he would repeatedly mutter. But of course I ignored his words. He needed to get used to such dangerous environments. He wasn't always going to be inside of a safe location like back in Henler. And we should head back soon. We've trained enough, we'll be heading to the Elven domain in a couple of weeks' time. Waylon stood up and stretched his back. Already? Tapping onto my bracelet, I took the bear out and sat down on a small chair next to the fire. "Oh, we having bear tonight?" "This too." Once again tapping onto my bracelet, I threw the fox on top of the bear. "A fox?" Hines said as he stood up to take a closer look at the dead fox. Extending his hand to try and touch it, right before his hand could touch the fox, a small hand grabbed onto his wrist. It was Ava. "Don't touch that." "Why? It's gross." "Is it?" I questioned, secretly taking a sip of Small Snake's drink. Snapping her head in my direction, Ava repeatedly nodded her head before pointing toward Angelica's direction. "It is. Just look at Angelica, she agrees with me." Leisurely sitting on her seat, although Angelica didn't say anything, she too seemed to be in agreement as her brows were slightly knit into a frown. Meeting my gaze, her face cringed a little. For some reason, I feel like Angelica is more disgusted by me. Ava seemed to have noticed our slight interaction as she coughed slightly. "Trust me, she was definitely referring to the fox, not you." "Are you sure about that?" "Didn't seem like that to me at all." Over a year had passed since we had been together, and by now pretty much everyone was used to Angelica. In fact, you could say that she and Ava seemed to get along quite well. Well, whatever. I shrugged my shoulders. Didn't really care about what they thought as I looked at Waylon, who approached the bear. Then taking out a small dagger from his dimensional space, he stabbed it in the middle of the bear's stomach. Staring at him from my seat, I opened my mouth and asked. About what you said, did Douglas contact you and tell you? Removing the guts from the beast, a pungent smell diffused around the area we were in. Ava and Angelica instantly glared in our direction. Of course they only glared. The one who was doing this was Waylon, who was by far the strongest of the group. Taking out the heart of the bear, Waylon nodded his head. Throwing the heart to the side, he continued to remove the organs. Yeah. He contacted me not too long ago. Did he say that we had to be back now? Taking the last organ out of the bear's body, Waylon clapped his hands together and droplets of blood spilled around the area we were in. We will return tomorrow morning and start making preparations for our trip to the Elven domain. We will be going by the portal. I figured that much. Imagine going all the way to the Elven domain by foot. That would take even longer than it took for me to reach Henler from the human domain. Just the thought sickened me. Anyways, how's your training been? It's been alright. I shouldn't have a problem breaking into rank in a couple of months. Granted that I don't take any special herb. Don't rely on those too much. With a slight nod, Waylon grabbed the bear and put it on top of the grill that rested above the fire. A sizzling sound rang out the moment the bear was placed on top of the grill. If you consume too many herbs, you'll end up being over-reliant on those. Just look at my daughter, I spoiled her too much. Sigh back when she was only... Here we go again. Should have known from the moment the word daughter was mentioned that Waylon would go on another hour-long story about how precious Emma was to him. It seemed like I wasn't the only one that thought this way, as the others also had helpless expressions on their faces. Well, not everyone. Sitting by the side, smoking a cigarette, Leopold would repeatedly nod his head as he listened to Waylon's words. Well, this isn't too bad. I thought as a smile crept on my face as I stared at everyone present. Who knows, this could very well be the last moment of peace that I would enjoy for a very long time. I hoped not, but my previous experiences suggested otherwise. Leaning back on my chair, I tried to make the best out of the little time of rest I had remaining. Chapter 377, Heading to the Conference. Rumble. With a low rumble, the ground shook and the doors of Henler opened up. Without saying anything, we entered the gates. Welcome back. Greeting us at the entrance of the city was another dwarf. By now, most people already knew who we were, and hence whenever they saw us they would greet us. Thank you. Greeting them back, we once again entered the city. Rumble. It wasn't long before a low rumble sounded again and the gates closed shut behind us. Go get some proper rest. We will start our preparations for the Elven domain over the next few days. Got it. The first thing we did was go back to our own residences to get changed. Having stayed in the nearby forests for over a month, everyone needed to get a proper bath. Although our tents were indeed advanced, they still didn't have showers built in them. As such, whenever someone needed to wash, they would need to go to a nearby river to get cleaned. Actually, I did briefly pass by Henler a week ago to talk to Malval about my sword, so it was only a week for me. Wham! Once I arrived at my residence and separated myself from the others, I headed for the shower. Turning the valve on, I let the warm water fall on my tired body, which had a couple of scars on them, before I relaxed completely. Once I was done with the shower, drying my hair with a clean towel, I sat on the bed. As I sat down, the water droplets that dropped down from my body traced down my toned body before they reached the clean bedsheets, wetting them. Let's see if anyone contacted me during all this time. Opening my desk drawer, I took out my watch and booted it on. Since there was no signal outside of the city as the dwarves tried to limit most outside communications, I had no idea about what had happened while I was gone. It wasn't even a moment before a long string of text appeared on my watch. All of them coming from the same individual. Oh, Malval called me. Is he finished with the sword? Him calling me only meant one thing. The sword was almost ready. After the incident with Inferno, and after spending 9 months improving my swordsmanship, I was finally able to convince him into forging a sword for me. Not many had such a privilege, and so I was very happy with this development. That aside, I also feel much better now that I no longer have the tracking device inside of my head working. Thanks to Jomnuk's coaching, Ryan was able to develop to the point where he could now easily hack into my chip and tamper with the device. He could turn it on and off whenever he wanted to. This was a great piece of news to me, as I could definitely make do with it in the future. Especially at the conference where I was going to meet up with the Union. With the chip tracking device off, they would of course be unable to tell that I was 876, but for sure I was going to let them understand that they had messed with someone extremely petty. Well, that was granted if the opportunity for it came. If there wasn't, I could just wait for later. Right, that fucker will also be there. Recalling a certain face inside of my memories, my lips tugged upwards. I've still got quite the score to settle with you, don't I? If there was someone whom I hated much more than the Union, it would be none other than the individual that brought me to that place to begin with. The pain I had suffered there. The sound of my teeth grinding together sounded across the room. Whew. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. There was a time for everything, and now was not that time. Standing up and quickly getting changed, I headed for the door of my room. Clank clank. Right now, my priority should be visiting Malville and seeing how much he progressed on my sword. I wanted to leave for the Elven domain with a new sword, especially since the ones I have been using weren't the right fit for me. They just broke too readily. If there was one thing that I hated about the 4th level, it would without a doubt be the tremendous heat. With it being so close to the Earth's core, it was extremely hot. Every time I went there, it would feel as though I was inside a steaming hot sauna. It wasn't pleasant, to say the least. You're finally here, human. Upon entering the main building of the facility center, Malville came to greet me at the door. Well, it was more like he was already there talking to the secretary, and only greeted me once he saw me coming in. Took you long enough. I was already done a couple of days ago. He grumbled, looking at me with a peeved expression. That fast? He sounded quite annoyed, but I merely shrugged my shoulders. Couldn't be blamed, I put all of my focus on training instead of anything else. Though I was impressed by his speed. Follow me. Bidding goodbye to the secretary, Malville brought me to his workroom. Just like in the previous times that I had been there, it was a mess. With equipment sprawled all over the place and scrap pieces of metal on the floor, it looked as though a storm had raged inside of the room. Fortunately, I was already used to this. Stepping over the garbage, we soon paused in front of a large desk. Thump. Dropping a long object that was covered in a thin white cloth onto the table, producing a dull sound, Malville slowly unfolded the sword. The moment he unfurled the cloth and my eyes paused on the sword, my face twitched slightly. Is this the completed sword? It took me a while to process the sword in front of me, if it could even be called that. It looked nothing like it. Rather, it looked more like a burned stick. With no sharp edges, no grip, and completely nothing that would make it look like a sword, the thing that was in front of me could not even be considered one. Don't tell me that he failed. But that was impossible. With Malville's pride, he would never show me something like this unless there was something more to it. As my thoughts paused there, I looked up to Malville, who was looking at the sword with traces of satisfaction on his face. Extending his finger forward and tracing it over the body of the piece of metal, Malville muttered to himself. How beautiful. Really? You call that thing beautiful? I really wanted to say those words out loud, but I managed to keep my mouth shut throughout the whole time. It was only after a couple of minutes passed that Malville finally regained himself and coughed slightly. Sorry about that, almost lost myself there. Right, I replied with a forceful smile. Oi, what's with that look? But it appeared that my face was quite obvious as Malville glared at me. Raising my hands in a show of peace, I calmly replied, nothing. I was just curious if this was the sword that you were planning on forging for me. Of course it is. Malville slammed his small hand on the table. He then pointed towards the long piece of metal. Can't you see that this is the frame of the sword? Well, yes, I could tell that much. Sigh, ignorance is such a bliss. Shaking his head, Malville interlocked his hands behind his back before walking towards another counter and picking up a small white hammer that was adorned with tiny blue, red, and green crystals. He then proceeded to walk towards the sword frame. Throwing me one last glare, he handed me the hammer. Here, you'll understand once you do it. You're giving that to me? I asked, confusion dyeing my face. Why in the world was he giving me the hammer? Just take it. Obviously annoyed by my question, Malville shoved the hammer in my hands and pointed at the sword frame. Now hammer the sword. Seeing just how serious he was being, I calmed myself down quickly and stared at the sword frame. I knew that Malville was not someone who would joke about things related to his profession, so without wasting any more time, raising my hand which held onto the hammer, I prepared to hit the sword with it. Inject your mana before you do it. But before I could even swing downwards, Malville's voice traveled through my ears. Got it. Closing my eyes, I channeled all of my mana into the hammer. Thum. The gems embedded on the hammer's side suddenly started to glow, lighting up the room in beautiful myriad colors. Once that happened, pointing towards the metal frame, Malvol shouted, "Now. Hammer the sword right now." Snapping out of it and nodding in response, I swung my hand downwards. Clank. A loud metallic ring swept throughout the room as the hammer in my hand came into contact with the sword frame. "Again." Malvol shouted after the ringing in the air dissipated. Clank. Without saying anything, raising my hand once again, I swung the hammer and a similar ring swept through the room. Once the ringing sound disappeared, Malvol once again shouted. "Again." Clank. Raising my hand again, I once again swung. Clank. Again. Clank. Again. Clank. And so for the next 3 hours, the same scene repeated again and again as I continued to hammer the metal. Twang. Smashing the hammer one more time, another loud ring rang out and a bright light suddenly enveloped the room. "Move back." As soon as the light appeared, pushing me back, Malvol snatched the hammer from my hands and once again hammered the sword frame. Clank. Clank. With each swing, his arm became faster and faster, and before long, the bright light that came from the sword enveloped the entire room, blinding me completely. "Give me your arm," he shouted before I felt a small hand grasp my wrist and bring me forward. I was completely blinded by this point, so I had no idea what he was trying to do, but it was at that moment that I felt a sharp sting coming from the tip of my finger and a strange worm-like feeling suddenly enveloped my body. Felt like I was being constricted or stung by a viper. I couldn't be sure because my senses were going haywire. But that feeling didn't last for long as all the remaining mana inside of my body suddenly got sucked out of me, and headed like a torrent towards the sword, to the point where I felt the pain. Ugh. Resist the pain. We're almost done. Malvol shouted from the side as my knees buckled up slightly. Ugh. Letting out another groan, one of my knees gave out and I fell to the ground, but thankfully supporting me from the side was Malvol as his big burly hands pushed me up from below. I can't last much longer, I weakly muttered, trying my best to remain awake. Every second that passed felt agonizing, and slowly but surely I was feeling all the energy in my body getting sucked out of me. Done. Twaying. Thankfully, right before I passed out, Malvol removed my hand, and another crisp ring rang out throughout the room. H. Falling down on the ground, I tried to catch my breath as sweat dripped down from the side of my face. What kind of demonic rite was that? You making a sword or what? I screamed inwardly. Unfortunately, I couldn't speak and exhaustion had overtaken me. Before long, once I managed to rest for a good minute, I finally opened my eyes. What do you say? It was then that I saw it. My new sword. Chapter 378, Heading to the Conference, 3. Is that my sword? My eyes flickered slightly after opening. It took me a couple of seconds for my eyes to recover from the previous bright light. But the moment I recovered, my eyes focused on the sword that was being dangled in Malvol's hands. Standing up, I reached out for the sword. It's yours. Malvol handed me the sword. Buzz. The moment my hand touched the sword, intense light exploded from it. This time I wasn't blinded. Next, my eyes opened up in amazement as I watched the sword in my hand gain a faint green luster. At a single glance, I could see just how powerful the sword was as the mana in the atmosphere agglomerated towards it at terrifying speeds. The sword was about 1/2 meter in length, glossed in a matte black color, and gazing at its sharp body that made it seem as though it could cut anything, my lips curled up in satisfaction. It's pretty light, I muttered as I focused my attention back onto the sword and moved my hand up and down to test its weight. It was a lot lighter than I had originally anticipated. In fact, it was so light that I thought that was holding onto a feather. Try injecting mana into it, Malvol said from the side. Sitting down on a stool, he rested his arm on the table behind him and nudged his head in my direction. Instead of checking it directly, why don't you try seeing for yourself just what the sword can do? Inject my mana? Yeah. Okay. With a slight nod, I did as Malvol instructed and channeled my mana into the sword. Buzz. Another low buzz suddenly sounded. Then, without me noticing anything, the ground beneath me began to creak, as fine miniature crevices started to expand from the bottom of my feet. What the? After that, my hands which were holding onto the sword started to become heavier as my muscles bulged upwards, trying their best to keep the sword in position. What in the world? I shouted as I turned to look in Malvol's direction. What is going on? Calm down. With a calm look on his face, extending his hand in my direction, he pointed at the sword. That over there is the ability of your sword. This ability. Lowering my head, I focus my attention back on the sword in my hands. Is the ability that Malvel is talking about, the ability to change the mass of the sword as I will? This ability reminded me of the ability of one of the artifacts that I previously owned. It was a ring, if I didn't remember wrongly. It could change its mass upon changing its settings. I quite liked it too, but unfortunately it was now long gone as it broke during the explosion that led me to that place. Taking a deep breath and stopping my mana flow, the sword in my hand returned to its normal mass and I glanced around the place. Let me test this in a different location. I then turned to face Malvel. Do you perhaps have a scabbard? A scabbard? Yeah, I kind of need it. The keiki style could still work without the scabbard, but I was just so used to it by now that it felt weird without it. Here. Rolling his eyes, Malvel reached out for something in the desk behind him and threw me a black leather scabbard. Thank you. Catching it with one hand, I thanked Malvel. Then, without saying anything else, I left the workspace and headed out towards a rather secluded area to test out my new sword. The area that I stopped was quite deserted and the land was flat. Perfect place to test my new sword. Putting my new sword into the scabbard that Malvel had just given me, I took a deep breath. With a thought, the mana in the air converged toward my hand that gripped onto the sword. As mana started to flow, the sword gradually started to glow and my pants started to feel heavier. Confirming that it was working, I stopped channeling my mana and the sword once again became lighter. Taking a step forward and focusing all of my mana on the tip of my finger, I tapped the grip of the sword. A clear and crisp sound was heard in the air the moment I touched the grip of the sword. Bang! What followed after that was a loud explosion as the earth before me tore apart and a long line that stretched over the next couple of meters appeared in front of me. A deep scar that sank at least a meter onto the ground appeared in my vision once the dust cleared out. Holy shit! Staring at the damage, my mouth hung on in shock. Was that really something that I did? Lowering my head and staring at the sword in my hand, my heart started to beat faster. Letting out a long breath and stabilizing my heartbeat, I stopped channeling my mana. Let me try without using the effect of the sword. Will there be a difference? A similar clicking sound rang in the air, but contrary to the previous attack, the ground did not break apart. Instead, a small line appeared in the distance, but that was all. The difference is huge. F equals ma. This was a formula that I previously thought was useless back when I learned it back in school. That was back then. Now things were different. Couldn't be any more grateful for it. Thanks to the mass increase, accompanied by the acceleration that was brought from the keiki style, a tremendous force was released from my sword, resulting in such a terrifying attack to occur. Honestly, the more I thought about it, the fonder I grew of the sword. It was the perfect fit for me. Looks like I've done a pretty good job, huh? Startling me out of my thoughts was Malvel's voice. Turning around, I nodded my head. Yeah, it's amazing. Hee. Malvel laughed in satisfaction at my response. Then, stroking his beard, he tilted his head and extended his hand. Give it back. This time it was my turn to tilt my head as I looked at him in confusion. But seeing just how serious his face was, without wasting any more time, walking in his direction, I handed him the sword. Here. Thanks. Taking the sword, Malvel traced his finger over its body. It looks like I still need to polish it. It's not exactly done. The fact that I had to seal it because of your rank is probably why. You sealed it. Throwing me a casual glance, Malvel rolled his eyes. You think someone like you can handle a sword of this caliber with your rank? No. I shook my head with a bitter smile. He was right. At my current rank, I wouldn't be able to properly use the sword. Had he not sealed it, the mana consumption would just be too much for me. On a good note, if it was sealed, it meant that my sword was still not at its fullest capabilities. Just the thought made my eyes shine. Focusing my attention back on Malvel, I suddenly thought of something. How long do you need to polish it? Giving me a long stare, Malvel smirked. I know what you're thinking about. Relax, I'll have it done before you leave this place. I'll hand it to you right before you leave. Is that so? Okay. It was only after hearing Malvel's words that my shoulders relaxed. Since I had no idea for how long I would be in the Elven domain as well as know when the next time I would be back in Henler would be, the next time that I would meet Malvel again, years may have passed. Fortunately, my worries were unfounded. Alright, I'll quickly get to work. You should also go back for now. Hugging onto the sword which was double the size of his body, Malval turned around and headed back in the direction of where his workshop was. I'll get it done on time, so relax. Got it. I replied back, staring at his small figure slowly going back towards the main building. I guess I should start preparing myself as well. Once Malval's figure completely disappeared, looking around the place, I decided to head back and pack up. My stay in Himmler was coming to an end. Since then, a week had officially passed and it was now the day I would head out for the Elven domain. Are you guys ready? Standing in front of a large portal, Douglas looked in our direction. We were 9 people in total: him, Waylon, Ava, Hein, Small Snake, Ryan, Angelica, Leopold, and me. Originally we were supposed to go with the dwarves, but decided against it and just decided to head there an hour after. The reason why we decided to head an hour after was because, where in the world is Malval? Ava muttered out loud as she leaned by the side of the wall. Turning to face Ava, our eyes met and we both bitterly smiled. He told me that he'll be done by today. That's what he said to me too. I wasn't the only one that was waiting for Malval, as Ava too was waiting for him. Having worked on it for over a year now, the flute which I had given to her a while ago was almost completely fixed. Of course, just like my sword, Malval had sealed it. That being said, it was now a lot more efficient than before, and not only that, from what Ava told me, it could now even allow her to have more beasts under her control. This was a massive boost in strength for me. He's here. Just when we were about to directly head to his workshop to find him, in the distance we saw a glimpse of a familiar figure. Running towards our direction with sweat all over his face was a young dwarf. Instantly our brows knit. Isn't that Malval's disciple? Having seen him multiple times already, we were all able to recognize him instantly. Running in our direction, his figure looked haggard and tired. Typical Malval, letting his disciple do the heavy work. I feel bad for him. As his leader and master, he should be more responsible. I muttered out loud as pity flashed across my eyes. It was then that I suddenly felt a pair of eyes burning holes at the back of my head. Turning around, I found Small Snake glaring daggers in my direction. What are you looking at me for? You. Raising his hand and pointing it at me, Small Snake opened and closed his mouth multiple times, seemingly struggling to get his words out of his mouth. Do you have any idea about the words that you've just... Here is your stuff. But before Small Snake could even finish his sentence, Malval's disciple arrived before us, instantly drawing my attention away from Small Snake. With heavy breaths, he took out 2 objects that were wrapped in thin white cloths and handed them to me and Ava. Thanks. Thank you. Looks like we're ready, Douglas said, standing by the portal. Since you guys have your stuff, we should get going. Then, turning around, he proceeded to make his way toward the portal. Let's go. Wait. But just before he could enter, Malval's disciple spoke up. Instantly everyone looked in his direction. With all of our eyes focused on him, a bitter smile emerged on his face as he scratched the back of his head. Master told me to go with you. Silence enshrouded the area around us. Before anyone could say anything else, he continued. Master said that I need to check on the 2 artifacts to see if there are any problems with them. Okay, you can come. Before I could say anything, cutting me mid-sentence, Douglas gave his approval. Looking at me, he tapped his wrist. We don't have much time and one more person won't hurt us, so let's go. No longer wanting to waste any more time, Douglas directly stepped into the portal and vanished. Following him was Waylon, and the others, who also had no qualms with the sudden addition of Malval's disciple. Well, since everyone is fine with it. Shrugging my shoulders, I followed the others into the portal. He may end up being useful. Finally, the long-awaited conference was about to begin. Chapter 379. Isanor. That was the name of the capital of the Elven domain. Situated on the northern and central hemisphere of the New World, one would think it to be a very cold place filled with snow. They couldn't be any more wrong. If there was one thing humans knew about the Elven domain, it was that it's beautiful. Thanks to the Elven magic, which was closely related to nature itself, an expansive land that was filled with greenery and the most breathtaking scenes came to be. All the humans that had ever crossed this land said the same thing. It's the most beautiful place that I've ever seen. Stepping out of the portal and suffering from the usual nauseating feeling that I'd get whenever I came out from one of those things, I stumbled a couple of steps. It had to be said that the distance we traveled was incredibly far. The side effects of the portal were much stronger than before. I felt a sensation akin to having my own stomach turned and rolled multiple times. It was anything but pleasant. Fortunately, with my now improved body, I was quick to recover. Wow. The moment I opened my eyes and saw what laid ahead of me, I lost my breath as if it was snatched away. Is that Isanor? A city surrounded by large canopy trees built upon low, rolling hills appeared in the distance. Short and wide towers were built along the side of the city, overlooking everything in the distance. The walls of the towers were made of a marvelous murky-colored rock, as if they were sculpted in a way that supported the infrastructure below the city. Behind the city, in the background, water poured down towards the smaller towers in a narrow waterfall. The faint water particles that lingered in the air refracted the light coming from the sun and drew a beautiful multicolored rainbow that added vibrancy to the city. Below the waterfall was a large lake encircled by beautiful white buildings. In the middle of the lake was a small island where an enormous white building adorned in silver and gold stood. The light coming from the sun was perfectly reflected by the gold-coated areas of the building, further adding to its elegance. "Welcome to Isanor." A melodious and crisp voice rose in the air, waking me up from my daze. Then, turning my head, I saw a beautiful elven lady greet us at the entrance of the portal. With delicate features and beautiful hair that was a mix between gold and silver, I could immediately tell that she was a high-ranking member of the elves. She wore a white tunic paired with breeches covered by long, thin robes. Smiling kindly, she turned and extended her hand towards the city in the distance. "Nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about you humans. My name is Cecilia and I will be bringing you to the city." Then turning around, she elegantly walked over a small pathway. "Let's go." The first one to follow her was Douglas, who stared at the city in the distance with a rare sparkle in his calm eyes. Behind him, Waylon was the second to follow as he too looked at the city with a rare excitement. He must be missing Emma quite a lot, huh? It was understandable. After having not seen his daughter for such a long time, he must for sure be wanting to meet her at all cost. Especially since he heard about the things that she was going through. The others should also be there, no? Gazing at the city in the distance, my lips tugged upwards. I guess I'll be seeing them soon too. Lightly pressing my toes on the ground, I followed the others towards the city. With a grin, I thought, I wonder what kind of face he'll make when he sees me. It's that face again. Step back. Snapping me out of my thoughts was Small Snake's voice. Turning around, I found him staring at me with a deathly pale face. "What's with you? Stay as far away from me as possible," Small Snake said as he took a couple of steps back, dragging Ryan and the others behind him. I shook my head at his reaction. So extra? The city wasn't located far from the portal. It was about a half-an-hour walk. The reason why the portal was located so far off from the city was because the elves wanted to avoid a scenario where instead of allies coming from the portal, enemies would appear. Of course, the enemies could very well set a portal in the city, but that was a lot harder to do. Walking through a small forest, penetrating the leaves of the trees, a net of light appeared on the ground beneath us. The air was a bit chilly, but whenever I passed through the small net, a gentle warmth would envelope my body, prompting me to move towards where it was. "We're here." Halting her steps, Acelia, the elf that was guiding us to the city, looked behind her in our direction. She then pointed ahead of her where a long bridge stood. "This over here is the Bridge of Island, and there is one rule that must be kept at all times when crossing this bridge. That is, only one person can cross it at the same time." "Only one person?" Douglas raised his brow. Leaning his body forward, he looked at the bridge in the distance. Retaining the smile on her face, Acelia nodded. "Yes, only one person. It's our tradition. We have no problem with that. Thank you." A soft wind suddenly flew and Acelia's hair fluttered. Taking a step to the side, she motioned Douglas to head to the bridge. "If you would please." "Okay." Smiling kindly, Douglas didn't say anything else and moved towards the bridge. It was then that something suddenly happened. The moment he stepped onto the bridge, the outline of a barrier suddenly appeared in our vision, completely enveloping the city. Apart from tradition, the barrier over here is set up using an ancient spell that enables us to determine individuals who have demonic energy inside of their body, Acelia said without a change of expression. Following her words, she turned to look in Angelica's direction. "We've already heard about you from the dwarves and have made a special exception. Here." Taking out a small bracelet from out of nowhere, Acelia handed it to Angelica. The bracelet is coated with a special spell that will tell the others that you are on our side. Taking a couple of steps forward, Angelica extended her hand and took the bracelet. Putting it on, a white glow suddenly enshrouded her whole figure. You're all set. You should have no problems entering the city now. Turning her head, Angelica gave a small nod of appreciation to Acelia. Replying with a small smile, Acelia's ears suddenly twitched before she turned to face our direction. It looks like he's already made it. Who's next? I'll go. Waylon offered himself up as he took a step forward and passed through the bridge. The bridge's length wasn't long, about 100 meters or so, and thus before long, Waylon soon appeared on the other side of it. Following him, the others also went one by one until finally it was my turn. Your turn. Without saying anything else, I took a step forward and also started to cross the bridge. Right as I took a step into the barrier, a warm glow enveloped my body. Ignoring it, I kept moving forward. I can't see the end of this. Walking forward and staring below the bridge, I swallowed a mouthful of saliva. The bottom of the bridge was incredibly deep, and without a doubt if anyone fell from it, they'd end up dying instantly. Only S ranks could survive such falls as they could somewhat fly. I wish I can fly. I enviously thought as I looked below the bridge. For one to be able to fly, they must have an incredibly amount of psion control as well as mana. The principle was the same as when coating my sword with psions, but instead rather than coating the sword I had to coat my body, which was a lot harder to do. That aside, once I finally crossed the bridge, I moved to where the others were, inside of a large square. The inside of the city were just as beautiful as the outside. The streets were made of pasty-colored pebbles and single lines of grass crossed in between every couple of meters of the road, further adding vibrancy to the environment. Sophisticated buildings in white coated with gold and silver appeared by the side of the road, further adding to the elegance benefiting elven creatures. Around us, elves appeared everywhere. Despite our appearance, none of them seemed to be bothered by our presence. They just went about their business, treating our existence as nothing out of the ordinary. A couple others humans have entered the city before you guys. This is why they aren't shocked by your sudden appearance, Acelia said as she appeared behind us. Seeing our reaction of the city, her lips curled up slightly before she pressed her foot on the ground and followed a certain path. Follow me, I will be bringing you to your residences. It will be right next to the dwarven ones. Are we not going to stay with the other humans? Waylon asked. Hope filled his eyes. Turning back, Acelia shook her head. Unfortunately not, you guys are guests from the dwarves. They requested for you to be with them. Of course, if you want to see the other humans, you may be able to do that during the inauguration of the conference, where we'll host a banquet for all the races to join. Pausing and placing her finger over her chin, Acelia's brows knit slightly. The ceremony should be in about a week's time when everyone is here, so you won't have to wait long. Of course, you can also meet them in their residence, but they'll be coming at different times, so I'm not sure if the people you're looking for will be there. All right. Waylon replied with a simple nod. Undisguised disappointment could be felt from his voice. Walking up to him, I tapped him on the shoulder and whispered, I think this is for the best. Why do you say that? I know you miss Emma, but what do you think will happen when you suddenly show up in front of her after not having seen her for a few years? Waylon's face froze at my words. Nodding my head, I continued. That's right, she will most likely be very angry at you. Not that it's bad, but you should also take this chance to properly analyze how the situation in your family is. I'm quite certain Emma is not the only one that got invited from the Rochefield family. Try to get a better understanding of the situation before you act. With Waylon's brother? Cousin? Honestly, forgotten how he was related to Waylon, but with him having taken the reins of the family for quite a while, even if Waylon suddenly showed up again, there was a chance that the divide in the house would continue. After all, he must have already bought some of the people's loyalty after having stayed in that position for that long. Exposing his existence right now was not ideal. You've managed to not see her for what, 3 to 5 years? What can an extra few days do? Get a hold of your house before anything else. Who? Listening to my words, Waylon suddenly let out a long breath. You're right. I was being too impatient. You were. Patting him on the shoulder, I smirked. Knowing Emma's personality, there's a high chance she's going to be more pissed about the fact that you didn't meet her as soon as you knew she's there. Hee hee. He didn't have to know this part. Patting him on the shoulder more, Pity flashed across my eyes before I followed Celia towards our residence. Chapter 386. Whoa. Taking a step out of the portal, Emma looked at the scene presented before her with amazement. Wearing a white baseball hat along with a simple shirt and shorts, Emma's curiosity piqued as she looked around the place with an excited gaze. Curb your excitement. Exiting the portal after her was Melissa. Squinting her eyes and taking out her glasses, she glared in the direction of the sun. If only that damned bastard didn't force me to come here, she muttered out loud, obviously not hiding the displeasure in her voice. Overhearing Melissa's comments, Emma turned around and asked, "What's wrong about coming here? I would have much rather spent my time finishing my project. And what's fun about that? You never go out. Just look at you, you remind me of a vampire." Pausing, Emma pointed at the sun. "The first thing you did as soon as you got out was glare at the sun." "Shut up." Rolling her eyes, Melissa put her glasses back on. As the two of them were bickering, not far from them the other group members were slowly coming out of the portal. It wasn't long before 8 more people exited the portal. Once the last person came out, an elf came to greet them and led them to an area outside of the portal where there were others waiting. As they were headed towards the larger group, Emma was instantly able to spot Amanda. "Amanda, you're already here." This part wasn't hard since she stood out quite a bit. The fact that most of the males' gazes were directed at her also didn't help since it only made it easier for Emma to spot her. Walking up to her, Emma tried to hug her, but Amanda swiftly dodged, prompting Emma to pout. "Hey. Save that stuff for Kevin." "Hey." Emma shouted even louder as her cheeks turned rosy. "How long have you been waiting here?" Emma asked in hopes of trying to switch the topic. Fortunately for her, Amanda had tact. Pretending to have not seen anything, she casually answered, "It's been about 3 hours since we arrived." Lifting her head and staring into the distance, toward the direction of where Emma came from, Amanda continued. "Besides you, we should be waiting for one more group before they will bring us to the city." "Another group?" Emma turned her head and stared in the same direction as Amanda. "Any idea who it is?" "They are from another city." "Oh. Which one?" "I'm not too sure myself. They're already here," Melissa said from the side, gazing into the distance where another group was slowly headed in their direction. At the forefront of the group was a young man with black hair and blue eyes. He may have been the youngest of the group, but his demeanor was unmatched as it contained this rare elegance to it that made him the focal point of the group. "Aaron, so it's him." A rare of solemnity appeared on everyone's faces as their eyes paused on him. They all naturally knew who he was. After all, it was hard for them to not have heard of him when he had been a thorn on their side during their first year. Second and third year for Emma and Melissa. Walking in small strides, Aaron's eyes soon paused on their group, and a surprised look flashed across his face. It wasn't long before a smirk followed after as he walked up to them. "It's been a while since I've seen you guys." Pausing, Aaron's eyes soon stopped on Amanda. His brows knit for a second before they relaxed. "You must be Miss Stern. I think we maybe briefly met during your first year. It was unfortunate that you left after and we were unable to see each other." "Okay," Amanda replied with a short and indifferent acceptance of his words. Not expecting such a reaction from Amanda, Aaron's smile froze for a very short second before he regained his calm. "It seems like Miss Stern isn't too keen on talking to me, so I will take my leave." Smiling at Amanda, Aaron turned around and left. Staring at his back from behind, Emma turned to look in Amanda's direction. "Hey, are you sure you want to treat him like that? His guild is pretty powerful. You sure you won't regret this in the future?" "No." Amanda shook her head as she stared at Aaron's back. She knew very well what type of background Aaron had. He was the heir of the most powerful guild in Ludwig City, one of the 4 great cities in the human domain. In terms of power, his guild was not as great as hers, but in terms of influence it was very powerful. They were not someone that the current Amanda could deal with if they truly decided to attack them. Lowering her head and staring at Emma, Amanda softly said, "The reason I'm doing this is because he is already working with another diamond-graded guild in Ashton City." "He is?" Surprised flashed in Emma's eyes at this revelation. "Why would they reach out for the other guilds?" "Because they are greedy," Amanda coldly replied, her voice taking a chilly tone. News about her father's disappearance had now spread wide, and not just the guilds in Ashton City, but even the other guilds from outside wanted to have a slice of her guild. Amanda was obviously enraged by this, but she was also helpless at the same time. Thank you for coming all of the way here to Isanor. Disrupting Amanda out of her thoughts was a crisp and melodious voice that came from the distance. Lifting her head, Amanda's eyes paused on an elf standing far ahead of the group. As he addressed them, he seemed to be very polite. Sorry for the long wait. Now that everyone has gathered, I will escort you to the main city. So if you would please follow me. Turning around, the elf started to walk along a pathway that led to the city. As he left, one by one, the other people present slowly started to follow him. Let's go. The first one to move out of the three girls was Emma, who quickly lined up and followed the others into the city. Excitement flashed across her eyes. Here, take this. Just as Amanda was about to follow Emma, grabbing her shoulder, Melissa handed her a couple of things. Since you will be displaying your talent to everyone, you might as well be useful and advertise this as well. The better the performance, the richer we become. Finished speaking, Melissa also lined up. Staring at Melissa in confusion, lowering her head, Amanda stared at her hand where several different cards of various colors rested. Blinking a couple of times, her lips tugged upwards ever so slightly. Clank. A metallic ring sounded throughout a small room as a broadsword crossed against two sharp daggers. A circular pressurized wind sprang out from the point of contact between the blades as the two individuals distanced themselves from each other. Gazing at each other from the distance, the individual holding onto the broadsword lowered it and complimented his sparring partner. You've improved a lot. You too. The two individuals were none other than Kevin and Jean. After arriving early to the Elven domain and meeting up together, they decided to spend most of their time sparring against each other. As they had been doing this for the past 2 years back at the lock, both of them were quite familiar with the way the other fought, hence why they were able to fight against each other evenly. Although they had not sparred together ever since leaving the lock, the both of them were still quite familiar with each other's styles. Hence they were able to make the most out of their training. If there was one thing that was different about the two, it was that Jean was now a rank lower than Kevin at. This wasn't due to a lack of training, however. Jean had been training harder than ever. The reason for his current rank was that he had acquired a 5-star dagger technique not long ago. Since he was now more focused on improving his dagger art, the time he spent on improving his rank lowered significantly. And it was because of this that he lagged behind Kevin in terms of rank. Wiping the sweat that had accumulated on his forehead, Kevin put away his broadsword. This should be enough for today, the others will be coming here soon. Okay. Putting his daggers away, Jean nodded in response. Moments prior to their spar, they heard from the others that they had already arrived. Pulling his hair back, Kevin turned around and headed out of the room. They should be here soon. Let's go meet them. Without saying anything, Jean followed him from behind. At the same time, in another part of Isanor. You guys have finally made it. Welcoming us with open arms was Rander. Turning his head to face my direction, he asked, Did you guys sort everything out? Yeah. I nodded. We managed to get it in the nick of time. In fact, we also brought someone else with us. Taking a step to the side, I proceeded to point at a certain someone who stood at the back. That person was none other than Malvol's disciple, whose name I still did not know. Ho ho, isn't that Malvol's disciple? A look of surprise flashed across Rander's eyes as his gaze paused on the only dwarf in our group. He of course also knew who the dwarf was. Given Malvol's fame, it was hard for the elders to not pay attention to him. After all, if one of their most famous blacksmiths had a disciple, he would most likely become someone important in the future. As an elder, Rander had to pay close attention to such things. Good. This will be a great experience for him. What followed after the surprised look was a satisfied one as he repeatedly nodded in approval. With him around, we won't have to worry about our weapons breaking, he jokingly said as he patted him on the shoulder multiple times. After saying a couple more things to Malvol's disciple, he focused his attention back on us. Alright, now that you are all here, I presume that you guys have already seen your rooms, correct? Yes, we have. We're currently going to go for a stroll around the city to get a better idea of the place, Waylon replied. At the moment he was wearing a skin mask in order to hide his face. He wasn't the only one wearing a mask as we were all wearing one. Although the chip inside of my head was disabled, I didn't want to take any chances and therefore chose to wear a mask. If someone recognized me, things would get troublesome. The only one missing from the group was Douglas, who joined Gervis to talk with the higher-ups of the elves. Anywho, the reason why we were currently going out was, just as Waylon said, to get a better look at the city. Just like in Henler, I wanted to get a better idea of the environment I was in so that if trouble arose in the future, I would have more options open for me. Information was key to everything. Actually, the real reason was because we wanted to know where the others were staying. But what I previously said wasn't that far from the truth. I see. Stroking his beard, Rander pursed his lips before nodding in agreement. That's a good idea. I've got a map of the place if you want. That can help you familiarize yourself with the place better. That would be ideal, Waylon replied, taking up on Rander's offer. Very well. Laughing a little, Rander threw Waylon a small device which contained the map of the city. Enjoy your little tour.